I'm Rylan Shoemaker. I'm a sophomore from Abilene, Texas, studying International Relations and Environmental Studies, and I would like to welcome you to the January Series 2019. We would like to give a special welcome today to our guests at 3 of our 52 remote webcast sites in Brookfield, Wisconsin, Sioux Center, Iowa, and Spring, Texas. And now if you would all please pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for Calvin College and for the January Series, that we can dedicate this hour of our days to coming together and learning. Thank you for William Powers, that he can be with us today. Please bless him as he speaks. And Lord, I ask that you bless us and be with us as we listen. In you, all things are made. I praise and thank you that we get to count ourselves among your loved and beautiful creations, and I ask that you open our hearts today to how we, through you, can truly be stewards of your creation. In your name we pray, amen. And now Becky Simpson, Director of Residence Life, will introduce our guest.
Our speaker today is William Powers. He's an award-winning speaker, author, activist. He's worked for 20 years in sustainable development in Latin America, Africa, and North America. Currently serves as a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute and as a New York University professor. As a third-generation New Yorker, he became interested in the American culture of speed, especially as it was in contrast with many other cultures he's experienced. He speaks and writes broadly on this topic, and his books will be for sale in the West Lobby immediately following this presentation, and he'll also be there to greet you. He's lived in a tiny house, off the grid, tiny apartment in New York City, and now lives in Bolivia with a tiny family, pursuing their values of sustainability and deep community. Calvin College is grateful to Friends of the January Series for underwriting today's presentation. And now give a warm welcome to William Powers.
Thanks so much. I am honored and blessed to be here in a community with identity at Calvin College, a transformative place, and we're going to talk about identity and transformation today. You know, I'm arriving from the subtropics from 80-degree weather 2 days ago. I came with my 13-year-old daughter, who's in the audience someplace. There she is. She's not used to the cold. So you can keep her warm back there. But, you know, we arrived Monday night, and we had a beautiful day yesterday. You know, we actually got our sneakers on and skated around on the Calvin College pond a little bit. And it was just so much fun, enjoying the winter weather. And, you know, down in Bolivia, where we are, I'm directing the Living Well Collaborative, which looks at the connection between sustainability, happiness, well-being, and also we have a 5-acre permaculture farm. We have, you know, fruit trees and gardens, and we live in a transition town with people from 30 countries in a town of 5,000. And we're going to talk some more about that. But this simplification of our lives and living like this for the past 5 years in Bolivia, you know, it actually goes back to my parents, who lived a very interesting life. They were social scientists and also very devout. So there were 2 holy books in our household. One was the Bible, and the other was the New York Times. I think there's a contradiction there. But every meal would start out with a prayer, like we just had just now, and then my dad would have the inevitable clipping from the New York Times, something about sociology or economics or politics that he'd share. And my mom was really big into having us be in habitat. You know, we had paths in our backyard that went nowhere, just to appreciate the St. Francis statue at the end of the path. Or they'd send us out into the swamp area in the woods just for hours with no schedule or agenda, just to enjoy nature. So that was a real gift that I think I've taken with me into life. And you know, we had guinea pigs in our household. Anyone have guinea pigs as pets at any point? Yeah, I know, they're really cute. My mom used to say that they're the proof of sort of God's love in our household. They were just so cuddly and trusting and lovely. And we had Fred and Minnie, Fred Flintstone and Minnie, our first 2. Do you know, Fred sired 26 children throughout his life. We gave them out. We populated our whole neighborhood on Long Island, suburban Long Island, New York, with guinea pigs. But an interesting happened on Easter morning when Fred was in his old age. He'd sired all those kids. Do you know what he did? He actually crawled out of his cage, walked across my sister's bedroom, down the stairs into the living room, crossed into the solarium, And he chewed the ribbon on the Bible, opened to the Easter story, and died under the cross. Now, I'll leave it up to you to figure out what that story means. But I think it says something about mystery and nature and love. We also had turtles, box turtles. I know that you all in Michigan also have these eastern box turtles that when we were kids, my mom would take us out into the forest, and you'd see this little pimple of oak leaves raised up, and you knew that was a turtle. Sometimes it would be a rock, but usually there would be a turtle there, and we'd find it and bring it home. Now, at this point on Long Island, this was in the 1970s, there were still big open spaces, where that you could enjoy, and so forth, forests and everything, and we just loved those turtles. Until one day, something kind of sad happened. We were out there with my mom, my sister, and suddenly we heard a loud industrial sound, and then off in the distance I could see like smoke billowing, and then suddenly towards us came this big yellow bulldozer. And I saw one of the bumps in the oak leaves, that was the turtle, and the bulldozer was coming towards it. My mom grabbed my arm and said, "You can't save that one." What was happening was that was my first introduction to ecocide, or the destruction of nature by our economic model. And it was very powerful for me to feel that, wow, they can take down this whole woods that I love so much. Actually, I felt like those woods were part of my larger body in some ways, and part of our family. And they got taken down. So I think that made a big impression on me. And I think that sort of leads into what we want to talk about today, which is sort of identity and creation care. There's a lot of talk about identity, like male, female, Christian, Muslim, rich and poor, other ways that we identify ourselves within human identity. But could we probe that concept a bit deeper today and look at ways to think and feel more broadly about what it means to live an identity that's simpler, more joyful, and more biocentric? Here at Calvin, you have a Board of Trustees approved sustainability statement, which actually takes seriously, the mandate to care for God's good earth. The British scientist Peter Russell has said, the root of our environmental crisis is an inner spiritual aridity. Any truly holistic environmental policy must include this in its approach. We need not only conduct research in the physical and environmental sciences, but also explore the psychological and more sacred science. Okay? Interesting point. And then there's the late, great theologian Thomas Berry, who said, in relation to the earth, we've been autistic for centuries. Only now have we begun to listen with some attention and with a willingness to respond to the earth's demands that we cease our industrial assault, that we abandon our inner rage against the conditions of our earthly existence, that we renew human participation in the grand liturgy of the universe. So the universe is liturgy. Like everything out there is celebrating. Every horse is beautiful, every leaf falling from the tree, every pond frozen over. And we can find a vocation for college students in this statement from Berry. We could maybe imagine some fresh ways to identify as participants in the liturgy of the universe. We're talking about identity, but I didn't always have the identity that I have today as what we're talking about. I wasn't thinking about these questions. In fact, when I was coming out of graduate school in Georgetown in DC, I was interviewing for jobs, just like some of you will be doing, and I had gotten some offers from the State Department. It was international relations degree, from USAID, but I also had interviewed with a humanitarian NGO. And they called me up and they offered me a job in Liberia. So my first reaction, even though I'd studied international relations, was, where's Liberia? I couldn't even picture it on the map. And my second thought was, oh gosh, that's actually a war zone with child soldiers and so forth. They said, don't worry, the 7-year civil war is over. Well, it turned out to have been the 14-year civil war later that we found out. And they said, your job description, Bill, it's going to be easy. It's save the rainforest and reduce poverty. Pretty easy, huh? So I took the job. I turned down the more prestigious offers. I went to Liberia into a war zone. I had 150 staff that I was suddenly supervising, bringing food to hundreds of thousands of people in this area. It was incredibly intense. We actually had, this is what I first saw, that you probably know that Liberia is America in Africa. It was founded by freed slaves. And they have the same flag as we do, with just one star. That's the First Baptist Church in Monrovia, named after James Monroe. And there's a real kind of sense that, they're connected to us. The program I had, we would get US government surplus commodities and ship it through this major network through 4 area offices to orphanages, hospitals, clinics, and food for work projects. But in the meantime, while I was doing all of this, I realized that, the Oriental Timber Company, a Malaysian company cutting down huge swaths of virgin rainforest, shipping them to Chinese coastal factories for transport to Home Depot and European places like IKEA. And this was happening under our noses. And so Charles Taylor was in power. He was the dictator. He's now in prison for war crimes in Europe. And basically, we were like, well, what can we do? Well, this is what you do in sort of conservation and aid. We worked on community forestry projects to actually get legal tenure for communities to their forests to sort of hold back these multinational companies. We worked on sustainable agriculture, alternatives to slash and burn, eco-stoves, stoves that are 3 times more efficient with wood. And there was a timber embargo put on Liberia. All of this happens, and it was exciting, and it was working 24/7, and it was very busy. So after several years in Liberia, I was transferred with the same aid group to Bolivia in South America. And I immediately saw the beautiful, mega-diverse context. Bolivia is one of the 10 mega-diverse countries, along with Indonesia, Colombia, and others, having the highest number of species in the world. It also is the most culturally diverse country in the hemisphere in terms of percentage of indigenous peoples. But I immediately saw, when I arrived there, too, 3 interlocking problems. One was poverty connected with deforestation. The second was Archer Daniel Midlands, in this case, and other US multinationals, cutting down huge areas of forest for the crops we consume, like soy, in this case. And finally, climate change, which is not just a word there. It actually affects the water supply for 2 million people in the capital of La Paz, because the glaciers are literally melting and affecting everyone. So what did we do in this context as aid workers, as conservation professionals? Well, one was we looked at things in terms of a corridor. This actually is a corridor stretching from Ambaro Park all the way to Madidi, all the way across the country. Species migrate across protected areas. So you look at it in terms of zones. So I had like 50 staff working in all these municipalities, doing environmental education, alternatives to deforestation, like heart of palm export projects, all of these things that were really interesting. The other major project we did, to give you a sense, when I was in AWARE, was this park. It's a beautiful place with waterfalls crashing into jungles. It was about to be cut down and deforested. Reminded me of that little deforestation in my backyard on Long Island. But what we did was we actually bought out 5 logging concessions, this blue area, and turned it into this national park. This was 3 million acres, plus this yellow area is an indigenous protected area. So it gave a homeland for indigenous people, protected the environment, and it helped reduce carbon emissions for American Electric Power, British Petroleum, and PacifiCorp, 3 big companies. So this was a pilot project in carbon sequestration's connection with deforestation. That's a whole nother talk. But just to give you an idea of what we were doing, and it felt really good and amazing because some of the people that we work with became ecotourism guides or park guards, or they were measuring the trees' circumferences to show that the sequestration was actually happening. So, when I came back from a decade of doing aid and development work around the world, I realized that, even though we had these local successes, there were some big, big problems still out there. We're losing an acre of rainforest every 2 minutes. And we are seeing acidifying oceans with their bleached coral reefs happening at exponential rates. As the Arctic melts, it creates more dark zones, which then absorb more solar energy, which then heat up the planet even more. That's a positive feedback cycle. Some of these things are happening at 1,000 times the background rates. The use of cars is exponential. The use of paper products. The swell of our species to almost 8 billion. So we're eating ever higher on the food chain. Do you know if you take the weight of all the domesticated animals on the planet, all the pigs, goats, cattle, and so forth, that we eat, and you compare it to the weight of all the wild animals, it's 50 times higher, the domesticated animals. So it's like, and that's going up, because as Indians and Chinese continue to, and others in the developing world, consume higher on the food chain, it's sending that up. So this is one species engaged in an industrial assault on our larger body, the living animate organism of Gaia within which we dwell. So Earth system science tells us that Gaia lives, that our assault on her is on ourselves, and that it's important for our survival that we stop this process. Now, it's also, interestingly enough, not making us happier. I don't know if you've seen the statistics, but even as GDP has gone up tremendously, I think it's tripled since the 1960s, happiness has stayed the same or gone down according to those Gallup surveys of the Cantrell scale, right? So more money is not equaling more happiness. And if you look at some of the recent suicides, Kate Spade, Philip Seymour Hoffman, many other celebrities who have actually made it to the top of the American dream and are still unhappy. So we have to ask about this bigger question. CDC says that suicides are up 24% last year. I had a personal story about this. I teach undergraduates down in Bolivia. They do this field intensive. They come down. I'm a professor at NYU, and I also work with undergraduates. And they were on my lands in Bolivia, like our permaculture farm, and we were talking about different things. And one of them said to me, she's a girl from Palo Alto, California. She said, in my high school, a bunch of kids, we're from a really privileged high school, she said, but a bunch of kids committed suicide by jumping in front of the trains. You probably heard about this. Yeah, some people have seen this in the news. It was several years ago. And she was actually from that high school. And she said, but Professor Powers, it's really messed up. Because you know what our parents did? Instead of looking at the root problem, they set up a 24-hour guarding of the tracks to prevent people from doing it. So they said, instead of probing the roots, Professor, they're guarding the tracks. And that kind of made me think about the fact that, in some ways what I was doing in these big projects and so forth was kind of guarding the tracks. And it wasn't really digging down. It was almost as if you're on the Titanic, right? And you're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but the whole thing is sinking. I kind of had that feeling. I felt kind of depressed when I got back from those 10 years of working. I really felt at a low point in my life. And I realized that it's all part of this, story of separation, which I'm sure you've heard about, which has 4 elements. And this is the basic cultural narrative in our story. The first is that humans are destined to dominate nature. And secondly, that our intelligence gives us dominion over Gaia, over Pachamama, over Mother Earth. And third, that we've conquered disease and we've overcome nature. That sense, And now with our minds, our sciences, we can create immortality and perfection, fourth, which includes biotechnology, robotics, cyborgs, DNA modification. We become, in a sense, like Harari says, like gods, small gods that don't know what they want. There's nothing more dangerous than that, right? Gods that don't know what they want. So we're taking this into our hands. During this point of kind of depression or feeling this way, I actually met a very inspiring American woman. Her name's Jackie Benton. She lives in a 12-foot by 12-foot house off-grid in North Carolina. So I was back from aid work. I was visiting my parents who had retired to North Carolina. And they said, hey, did you hear about this physician who lives in a tiny house and only earns $12,000 a year? I said, no, but I want to meet her. Yeah, so I called. I got her phone number. I called her. She was very elusive. She didn't call me back right away. So I was about to head back to New York City where I'd landed after all the time working when I got a phone call. Hey, come out to my 12 by 12. Let's have a chat. So I went out there and met her. And when I arrived, she was on her permaculture farm, and she was actually stroking the wings of a honeybee from her bee boxes. And we ended up spending 3 hours, this is her house, in North Carolina, kind of engaged in this beautiful conversation about how to put permaculture, which are the things that our grandparents knew and our parents forgot, the household as a unit of production and repair instead of a unit of consumption, how to be a radical homemaker and take power back to the household. Also how to lay out your land in zones very intelligently, where you have the center zone, which is the house, that's all sustainable, and then you have an outer zone, which is sort of fruiting bushes and so forth, and then you have a shared area in this intentional community where there was other families that Latino, African American, Anglo, and herself that shared a bigger piece of land. So it's very inspired, how the inner minimalism is set up. She was one of the pioneers of the tiny house movement. She's still living out there all these years. One of the interesting things was this actually led to a book that I wrote, which, her little story and that little experience that she invited me to live in the 12 by 12 for a season while she was traveling, and I had that experience of actually living there. I wrote a book about it and about the other homesteaders doing this. And it became kind of a surprise, cult bestseller, and it's 5th printing. It's in Chinese, and it led to an art collective in New York. You see, it says, "What's your 12 by 12?" So they actually built these 12 by 12s in New York City, and 100,000 people went through this art exhibit learning about simplicity. So it shows how one little seed actually led to something a lot bigger. And I'll tell you, one of the most important things I learned in the 12 by 12 was a poem that was just tacked to the wall. And it was by Albert Camus. And it was called The Physics of Happiness. It was just written by hand by her. And one night by candlelight, there's no electricity in her cabin. I read it, and it said this: The Physics of Happiness. Time in the open air, love for another being, freedom from ambition, creation. So time in the open air is obvious, being more in nature, being more connected. Love for another being means love for somebody, your close family, your friends. It doesn't mean having 10,000 friends on Facebook. It means love for another being. Freedom from ambition. You can be ambitious, but you're free from those conditionings. And creation. That is the beautiful part. Love and do what you will. You create from that deeper place that's beneath the waves. That's the true happiness, that level. So I took that with me into my life after the 12 by 12, back to New York. The big question, I think, in some ways is how do you go forward from this? We've talked about some serious issues and some real long-term issues of a paradigm problem, the story of separation. What do you do? How do you go forward? Well, let me just do a little quick exercise with you right now. If you can just close your eyes for a second and just visualize yourself for a minute, just take a deep breath, doing something that you really love. Who are you with? Are you alone or with friends? What does it look like? Just go to that place for a second. Okay, you can come back. Sorry to take you out of your beautiful space for a minute, but did anybody want to share, from the front, something that you visualized just now?
The view from my living room window of a little stream.
Okay, the view from your living room window of a little stream.
Reading.
Reading? Reading, okay.
Yeah. Hiking in the woods.
Hiking in the woods. We could go through other examples, but do you notice something in common with those? It's very simple things. I've done this with many groups, and it's always those types of answers: hiking in the woods, reading in solitude with friends. So why do we have this economy and this culture that creates so much distraction and busyness if those are the types of things that create the most happiness? That's a deep question. So for our own part, what did we do? Well, I went back to New York City, and my wife and I downsized from our 1,600 square foot townhouse, to a 340 square foot micro apartment. This is my wife in that apartment while she was pregnant with my younger daughter. And you can see that it's just that tiny IKEA fold-out table. It was like two 12 by 12s put together in the city. We got rid of 80% of our belongings. We didn't have a storage unit. It was gotten rid of in a big garage sale or given away. And we tried to put into practice some of what I learned in the 12 by 12 about simplicity and like the kind of almost Christ-like example this woman was giving of like having a tiny carbon footprint and waking up with tears of joy, as she said, over this tiny apartment or this tiny house that she lived in. Also in New York, we experimented with ways of living slowly in a big city. In fact, my book, New Slow City, is about this, where we look at urban sanctuaries. There are places in Manhattan that are quiet and beautiful. If you ever go to Greenwich Village, walk out Pier 45 to the end. You can't hear the West Side Highway, and you can find tranquility there. You can do that here in Grand Rapids or in Ann Arbor. You can always find these wonderful little spaces. Another thing is when you're walking through the city, look up. Look up to the third story, and you see like the shine of light on a baby grand piano through a window, or the Central Park hawk landing on a branch, or something like that up in the sky, the clouds moving. There's also rooftop organic farming. Some NYU students, where I teach, set up this farm as their own business. It's on top of the Standard Oil building in Long Island City. And they now provide, food for 40 restaurants in Manhattan. And they've expanded to new rooftops in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It's a successful business that actually grows everything local. And you could feed all of New York City on just 10% of the roofs of these buildings. So there's all these gorgeous examples of slow living. Slow parenting. This is an example. This family is doing slow parenting. They're not helicopter parenting. They're letting their kids kind of play. And it's kind of like the way that we grew up in the 70s. So we're coming back to that, which is beautiful. And there's so many great examples of how you do it without having to move to a 12 by 12 house. So don't worry you don't need to move to a 12 by 12 house. I'm not saying that. You can integrate it into your life. So after those years in New York City, we actually moved to this place, Samaipata, Bolivia. It's where the Andes meets the Amazon. This is where I'm coming in from a couple days ago. It's a gorgeous little place. My wife and I, having both worked for a large part of the 2000s in aid and human rights work in Bolivia, always had this dream of going back. We have a rich community there and connection to the place. And even while we were living those 5 years in New York, with her working at the United Nations and myself at the university and doing other things, we always had this dream. So 5 years ago, we made it happen. And we bought a piece of land, the 5-6 acres we have there. We built our own bioconstruction house. We're on the border of a national park that's 3 times the size of Yosemite and has more biodiversity than all of Costa Rica. It's an ecological municipality. It's one of these 24 eco-municipalities in the country, innovating as a transition town, which I'll talk about. This is our piece of land. When we bought it, it looked like the image on the left, where it was deforested. It had been used for industrial corn production and cattle. So it was like totally degraded, but we planted 500 trees, most of them like fruit trees and forest native species. It's coming back to life. You can see the image on the right, how it's changing. And it's incredibly powerful to see that change on an individual level. Here are some images from our land. That's our dog, Adobe. And we live in that round adobe house that we built from adobe bricks from our land, like just 5 feet from there. A local architect just kind of designed it. It goes around to the right as well. And it's pretty small. It's like 800 square feet. It has no heating or cooling because the thermal mass of the 40-centimeter adobes creates the regulation of temperature. All of the water is recycled through a gray water system. All the black water goes to a banana circle. That's my writing studio in the orchard. You can see some of the fruit trees that we planted. So it gives you an idea of the kind of texture of our lives. Now, we're not just kind of going there to escape reality or something like that. It's actually a transition town. Have you heard of the transition movement? There are 45 countries in the world that have 1,600 of these transition towns going for ecological sustainability, local consumption, low energy use. So we're part of this big network. And so we have community gardens. We share labor in work parties. all those types of activities, it's being done throughout the world. This is revillaging. It's the opposite of the urbanization trend, people moving back to villages for the high quality of life, the walkability, the lower cost of living, and connection to family. So it's an interesting trend, and some of the activities that we do are, this was a big kind of cleanup. The walls of the town were painted in different colors to have less waste, meetings in the market with local people. A big cleanup was done with 700 people, and then we set up a recycling program for the whole village. And meanwhile, the town, you can see here, even with this tiny GDP, it's on the far left, that's our town, Samipatsa. So GDP is 1/17 US GDP. This is a study that I did down there. And Samipatsa is also 1/17 the carbon footprint per capita. And yet happiness levels, according to the Gross National Happiness Survey from Bhutan, and also from the Happy Planet Index, are considerably higher in this part of Bolivia as compared to the average US. So I think this study kind of shows that you don't need to have this crazy economic growth in order to achieve well-being. And I'll just sort of show a couple images here. Like, I mentioned the turtles at the beginning. So, my daughters play with their turtles here, and that's a view over our land. So, it's kind of showing how I needed to, in my life, this probably may not be the same for you, was to live in and closer to nature and create a family culture and a community culture around that as the major goal. So, in conclusion, I'd like to ask, this is our path, so what's yours? Really it's kind of about where you're going to take this. And so this concluding part, I want to just ask you an important question. It's, what's your urgent charge if not transformation? What's your urgent charge if not transformation? The moral arc of the universe may indeed be long, but it bends toward justice for all of creation. The American poet Robinson Jeffers said, "The greatest beauty is organic wholeness, the wholeness of life and things, the divine beauty of the universe. We must uncenter our minds from ourselves." So if you want to become confident, could you unhumanize your views a little bit? Let go of the narcissistic preoccupation with the human version of things and return to the rock and ocean from which we come. There we will find our confidence. So creation care is self-care, is self-confidence. And to take you into this rest of your day and into the rest of your winter, I want to leave you with a reflection. And that's it. If there's a single field trip that all those Palo Alto high school students might take, it would be in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, in the Hoh River rainforest. This is an image from there. And I hiked there 5 years ago. I hiked it a long way, along a trail to the only square inch of silence in the continental US. In the redwoods, rising above, a small sign led me up to a thinner path well above the river to a spot that said 1 square inch of silence. So some good citizens actually identified this as the only place in America where there is no human industrial sound at any point during the year. So pausing in that spot, I considered that a square inch of silence could not be in a city or a suburb, nor near a highway or road of any kind, nor in a protected area with either snowmobiles or airplane noise above. That registers above a certain decibel level. So that left basically nowhere in the US, except for this single spot in the far northwest corner where there was only one weekly flight overhead, San Francisco Fairbanks. But those folks up there, they convinced Alaska Airlines to reroute that flight. And now they can maintain that spot as the 1 square inch of silence that remains. So it may not seem like a lot, right? 1 square inch of silence in a country with billions of square inches. But maybe even the tiniest niche is enough, even if only to know there still exists a place where the song of the world still plays, with no droning airplanes nor honking trucks, no car alarms or refrigerator hums. And perhaps that 1 square inch of silence is inside of each of us somewhere in the continents we call our bodies, a place where none of the 100,000 commercials we viewed in our lives are there. A niche where there's no Twitter feed, no multinational mining of our solitude. There's still a square inch in you that exists in that place, a square inch of unpoisoned rivers and detoxified blood, a place where we don't need the Sierra Club because there's no plunder. There's no chicken factories there, no genetically mutated lab animals. There's no need for eco-psychologists or even Outward Bound. That square inch of you is wild. You'll have to walk a long time to get there. It's in the extremes of your continent, and the signs are subtle. You'll have to drop baggage along the way, and you'll get scraped, and you will bleed. But when you arrive in that place, perhaps you'll be free. And maybe in that place, you might even realize that your true identity is no identity, that you've transcended cultural and anthropocentric ideas and have arrived in a blessed place, a place of simplicity and well-being and interbeing. That's a place, my friends, of love. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Thanks. Thank you.
All right, thank you for challenging us with that. It seems a little daunting, but I'm sure we'll get into that with a question. So okay. I'm Rick True. I'm Director of Alumni and Community Relations here at Calvin College. If you have a question that's written out, please feel free to hold that up and it'll be brought forward. And we'll just start with some questions that are coming in online here. All right, wondering if you can talk, well, individuals could, this question has to do with policies and what individuals can do. While individuals can certainly drive the slow movement with their own actions, have you seen any government policies that have been put in place to bring about slow movement?
Absolutely. One is, have you seen in Sweden, they have a 6-hour workday now? The big companies were doing it, and so the government basically moved the whole country to that kind of a basic framework. Carlos Slim, the world's richest man, has called for a 3-day work week, 3 longer days, and because you're more efficient, you have more time to recharge with your families. These are examples. Another example is, having healthcare. Honestly, if you look at some of the European countries, we're the only industrialized country without universal healthcare, single-payer healthcare. If you have that, it actually frees up citizens to not have to be tethered to a traditional job in order to have the basics of healthcare covered. So it allows what economist Juliet Schor calls self-provisioning, and being able to use the household in ways, whether it's creating your own jams or clothing, or being a farmer, or other activities that can supplement your incomes. So those are some examples of government policies that help us achieve some of this.
It seems like this might be great for people who are in a well-off position or a position of privilege to be able to carry out the simple life, but I'm wondering if you could talk about the connection between living simply and their connections to people in poverty, living in poverty.
That's a fantastic question. We have to make first of all, a big and blatant distinction between what we call poverty or destitution and subsistence living. This is an important distinction. As you probably know, the term underdeveloped, I'm talking in a global context now, was coined by Harry S. Truman in a 1948 speech, where he said the old colonialism is over and the new colonialism is bringing the underdeveloped regions of the world into development. So this was an interesting semantic twist, and everything that we do around development aid, it's based upon that basic assumption that there's this third world developing into the first world that's like us. But actually, if you look at the happiness and well-being studies, a lot of the happiest people are in the so-called third world. Why? Well, strong extended family networks, connection to family, connection to nature, free time, and so forth, all of these things. So they might look poor from the outside, but oftentimes there's a kind of a richness to that subsistence living. Now, there's also destitution, like what I saw in Liberia, and of course we should be doing everything we can to feed people who are starving and to bring people into a, like that kind of aid is appropriate. But not the kind where you see somebody in a basic subsistence level, we're trying to bring them into a northern industrialized way of living.
When living slow, what is the role of smartphones, social media, and the internet in your life, and do you have recommendations for others in trying to live slow?
I think as long as it's your tool and you're not its fool, it's fine. It's like use them intelligently. We use Skype for work, email, cell phones, and so forth, and that's wonderful. It's a question of like your inner kind of north inside. There's a cell phone right now, and how you use it, right? So if you have that kind of basic consciousness of the most important things in life having to do with your family, your deeper creativity, nature, and so forth, then they become tools towards really freeing yourself. I mean, I think it's wonderful how you can use them towards not having to be in any particular location, for example. We like to do technology fasts where you don't check email on Sundays. Even Saturdays after noon, we don't really use gadgets. And I think there's ways of doing it really smartly.
I wonder if you can talk about whether or not you see a connection between the slow movement and the Christian faith.
I mean, there's the book Slow Church, which you probably know of. And I think that essentially the slow movement, which, by the way, is a combination of movements, right? There's slow money, which looks at how we're investing our capital on a larger level. There's slow travel, which is when you travel to a place, not to do package tourism, but rather to engage in a more meaningful, contemplative way to where you're going. Slow food. There are hundreds of conviviums or places in the US and around the world. People gather to cook meals together slowly using locally grown materials and organic materials. All of these are part of the slow movement. So all of that, to me, resonates very much with the teachings of Jesus about simplicity and, living a more slower, happy life. Like I love the passage of, look at the lilies in the field, how they grow. They toil not, nor do they how does it go? They toil not, nor do they spin. But even King Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like even one of these. There's that beautiful message of simplicity and slowness and things being provided for you.
Thank you. Wondering if you can talk about how your children are educated, and do you plan to send them to university, or do you have them travel? Or are there other types of communities they're involved in for their education?
Well, actually, Amaya's here, and she's already had several invitations to come here to Calvin College, so and she's made so many friends here, so that's a possibility. I think that each child has to decide what they want to do. We give them all the options. She's in an English-speaking school where they have it's like a British curriculum. The younger girl is in more of it's called a 3000 pedagogy. It's like a Waldorf Montessori mix that actually focuses more on like nature and Latin American culture and so forth. So we try to give them all the tools we can, and we try to parent in a way that's more biocentric. Like no helicopter parenting, kind of like letting them have more, kind of like the way that I grew up, like more time in nature, more time with friends, those types of things, and not like one lesson after the next type of parenting.
Yeah.
Those are some of the ideas.
Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the transition cities and towns that you've mentioned, and if you could point out any areas in the US that are transition-oriented.
I've actually spoken in several transition towns. I was just in Sebastopol in the fall, California. That's a transition town. Another is Montpelier, Vermont. There's Sarasota, Florida, has a huge transition movement. That's where the US transition director lives, the co-director. And there's a new book, or like a online study that came out showing the successes of the different transition towns around the US. If you go to transition.org, or like Transition US, I think it is, just Google like Transition US, you'll see that study and you can read about all the different examples of positive things that are happening. However, let me just put a caveat in there. I do think it's more difficult to do it in this country. You know, here in Michigan, things were created around the automobile industry, right? So there's not good public transportation, unfortunately, as opposed to, say, a European town or even a Latin American town where things were developed before there were cars and everything is automatically dense. Like, so the new urbanism, you're developing dense cores, like walkable cores with public transportation, and then wild areas right around it. So unfortunately, things sprawl out a lot here. So even to get to a transition meeting or something, you're driving a long distance. So I do see it as a challenge. But I've seen a lot of exciting things. Even in New York, you know, we have transition streets where they have blocks that develop as transition groups, initiatives, and they block off the roads for parties, get-togethers with the families. They do community gardens together. They do joint purchasing and so forth. So it's ways of creating community even in a city block.
Yeah. Just following up on that, I wonder if you could give a little bit more of an explanation of how you find balance for life with nature in an urban environment.
Right. Wow, that's another tough one, but absolutely possible. You know, we actually ended up living a pretty happy, biocentric life, even in New York. And the way we did it, frankly, was going to those rooftop organic farms, working there, volunteering, going into Central Park. You know, the Ramble in Central Park, that area where everything is just winding paths, trying to find more work-life balance and putting it more towards life and less towards always working. And, you know, living in a more minimal way, having a smaller apartment, less expensive. And so these are some of the practices that we put into place. You know, the other really important one is having some kind of a spiritual practice, whether, even if it's yoga or meditation or contemplative prayer, ways that take you into that, you know, still small voice inside that Gandhi talked about. So you're not constantly caught up in just the sample sales and everything going on right around you, and you're connected to that bigger vision. Yeah.
I've had several questions about what life is like for you, and wondering, given the amount of energy that goes into raising animals, are you a vegan or vegetarian, or what is your diet like?
Yeah. Well, you know, we actually eat a lot from our own land. We grow, we have about 50 varieties of fruit trees, everything from papayas and bananas all the way to pears and apples and so forth, the tropical to temperate. And they fruit all throughout the year, basically because of the climate that we're in. And we grow a lot of vegetables. Sometimes we sell our surplus in the market in town. I am vegetarian, or you might say pescatarian. Every once in a while I eat fish, like wild fish, but I've not eaten any meat in the last 5 years. I found that change was very powerful for me. I mean, I'd always been an omnivore, a carnivore until then, but I realized, you know, the amount of water it takes just to get a pound of beef. And then I saw the actual Amazon being cut down. I was like, you know what, I have to make this decision because it's just not ethical for me to be doing this when I know what's happening. Or I saw Food Inc., Food Incorporated, you know, I saw what it's like in the factory farms. And I just decided at some point that that's what I had to do. But I'm not saying that everyone needs to do that either. It's like examining your own consciousness and seeing where you're at, but just being mindful of the fact that, you know, if you have a dog or a cat that you love, you know, you can extend that love to the pigs and all the other animals that are being treated very inhumanely in these factory farms.
So you mentioned the amount of water that it takes to raise animals. I have a question here wondering what you're doing for water and also what your bathing situation is like. You don't need to go into a lot of detail, so.
Yeah. Well, we actually are connected to the municipal water system. And so we have water coming to our house. The water is not potable in our town. Like, that's actually a real luxury of the so-called developed world, but the global north, is the fact that we've really figured that out, to have potable water in every tap, basically. my wife, who's American actually, in this town, was actually elected to the water board of our town, and she is bringing potable, she's helping to bring potable. And by the way, I'm going to answer the rest of that, but like, I just want to make clear that, what we're doing is not an opting out of our professions, working in conservation and, poverty reduction and inequality. We're still doing that. It's the same focus. We have graduate degrees in this, we work on it. It's just that we've changed our way of doing it. Like, whereas before we were providing, my wife and I, technical solutions through these big institutions, going in and imposing them in different countries around the world and so forth, and having some success and doing some good things. Now it's like we're in this space of a paradigm shift. We're changing our own paradigm in ourselves, and we're still acting, but we're acting locally. So she's on the water board. We work to create a historic conservation of this beautiful old town that was about to be destroyed by 5-story buildings and so forth. We're working on all these great issues. So, I just wanted to clarify that. But going back to the water issue, yeah, we have the water coming into our house. We drink it purified water from a spring nearby that we bring in, and then we bathe in bathtubs using that. But all the water is then recycled into the gardens afterwards.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Wondering what wisdom you can offer to multiple families seeking to enter a new way of living together.
Well, that's great. Josh, who I met yesterday, a senior here, has lived in a co-housing community here in Grand Rapids. He showed me where it was yesterday up on the hill, coming back from town after an interview. And he said that his parents actually, and their friends, 20 of them, got together, a couple decades ago and bought this piece of land, and they built housing together, and he's lived his whole life in this co-housing community. He said it was very powerful to be cooking meals together with more people. It expands the extended family. And I'd say one thing you can do is go to just Google intentional communities in the US. There's a website that has all 2,000, or some number like that, of intentional communities that spans everything from Twin Oaks in Virginia to the farm in Tennessee and everything in between. And there are all these options for young people to go and do that. And I think for older folks too, our elders, there's elder co-housing, sort of retirement communities that are more based on that co-housing principle. Like even Arcadia in North Carolina, beautiful community there that is now mostly elders, but they have the core area preserved with no cars going up to the house and stuff. And then everything's walkable with nature and woods instead of like spreading the houses out over a big area.
Wondering if you could talk a little bit about, for those of us living in Michigan or in colder climates, how would you go about living a little bit more off the grid in such, where the temperatures swing so greatly? And also, how can you stay connected with nature in Michigan in the dead of winter?
Go to Bolivia. No, I mean, I also I love the winter too. I think you can't do the same things we can. I mean, we have a winter in June, July, August where it gets pretty cold. You're lighting your fireplace and stuff, but we don't get snow or ice, so it's a little different. I mean, let's see. I don't have any real thoughts about that at the moment.
I have a couple questions wondering about how do you take care of medical concerns in healthcare? What about families who must live near a medical facility for reasons such as cancer, heart disease, etc.?
Right. Well, we kind of made the choice that we don't need to have the Mayo Clinic within, 50 miles of our house. I think we just decided that in living more simply, we would be a little more vulnerable to, diseases. I think also my wife and I both had a lot of experience living in other countries around the world. It wasn't something new to us, so over time we've gotten used to it. But there is something to that. It's a decision you have to think about and make, because we do have a hospital in our town, and they treat you very quickly for primary care, like within 5 minutes every time a doctor has seen us. And it's free. It's all free healthcare for kids and even for adults. But for anything serious like that, you have to go to the city, which is 2.5 hours away, Santa Cruz, and that's a long way if you have to get there quickly, Yeah. So, yeah.
What advice do you have for college students who want to live a minimalist lifestyle or be more sustainable?
Mm-hmm. Well, the way you're living now in college, right, in a small dorm, right? And with very few possessions, take that into your life. Take that instead of like, then when you graduate, all of a sudden you're conditioned, oh, I need to take out a mortgage and work a fancy job to pay for it and have X, Y, and Z, fancy vacations and car and so forth. That's where you get into the work and spend treadmill. So instead of doing that, kind of carry over that college experience of living small and simple into your life. And you can do that through living in an intentional community, like one of these co-housing things, or with urban co-housing, or other ways. And I think that's a very important thing to think about, because I find that among my friends and so forth, people look back at those college years as like a glory years. Mm-hmm. And I think a big part of it is because you lived more communally and simply, and you're in those networks. And then you graduate, and unfortunately you kind of move into a suburb or that kind of like isolated nuclear family kind of a situation we have. So I'd say bring some of the spirit of Calvin, of the dorms, of this life into your life somehow. And that's up to you. I mean, I'm not saying that you need to like do any of what I'm saying. I was giving you stories and examples because that's a great way of sharing ideas, right? But it's just inspiring you to kind of think more deeply about how this could apply in your life.
Wondering if you can give a perspective on what you miss or what difficulties you and your family have encountered in making the movement to a slow lifestyle.
Lots of insects everywhere.
You miss insects, or?
Well, I'm just saying, like, that was one of our challenges. When we first built our house there, like the insects were coming in all these different ways, and how you control them and how you control your gardens without using pesticides and so forth. In terms of what I miss, really not that much. I mean, maybe connection with my family here. We do come back once a year, sometimes twice even if there's some work reason to come back. But being closer to family is one thing that I'd say I miss.
Question from a 6th grader wondering, do you think we can still save the world from climate change?
That's a deep question. I mean, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientists are saying it's pretty much too late, or that we have this kind of climate momentum, and it's very unlikely that we'll hit the 2.7 degree target from the Paris Agreement, and even if we do, that's really not going to avert climate chaos, essentially. So a lot of people in the UN and, in governments are working on adaptation to climate change at this point. How are we going to adapt our systems to this coming change? So I don't want to say that to sound negative. I just want to be realistic. I like the new book that came out, Drawdown, from Paul Hawken and others, Bill McKibben and other scientists and activists. Drawdown is just saying, like, here are the 100 really good ideas, the top 100 things we can be doing with photos and with images. Like, this is what we could do. And Drawdown's calling for a major reduction below the Intergovernmental Panel's recommendations. So I think, the best thing that you can do is live your life as if it's possible. I like to say, even if you're a philosophical pessimist, be a pragmatic optimist. And just act as if it's going to happen, and it will. There's no certainties. There's absolutely no doomsday certainty whatsoever. And if everyone here in this room makes one small change and connects more to each other, connects more to nature, and the paradigm starts to shift, we could see an enormous positive change in the future.
Well, thank you. I think we'll end it on that hopeful note. So Thank you to our underwriters for a day and for you to being here.
Okay,
and you'll be available in the lobby.
Thank you very much.